The wind that scoured the high plains of the Wyoming Territory in late 1878 had teeth. It did not merely blow. It bit and chewed at the corner posts of the fences, stripped the paint from the siding of the houses, and worked its way through the thinnest cracks in the window frames to settle as a fine. Gritty gray dust on the polished furniture. It was a brutal, incessant force that reminded every soul in Carbon County that they were guests on land that did not want them. To Clara Vance, the wind sounded like a conversation she was too tired to understand, a ceaseless muttering about emptiness and the inevitability of decay. Clara was 24 years old, an age that felt suspended between the ignorance of girlhood and the hardened resignation of the matrons who populated the town of Bitter Creek. She had been a wife for 3 years and a widow for exactly 3 weeks. The silence in the ranch house was heavier than the wind. It was a physical weight, pressing down on her shoulders as she sat at the heavy oak desk that had belonged to her husband, Samuel. The ledger lay open before her, its pages filled with columns of numbers written in Samuel's sprawling, confident hand. Her own handwriting, small and tight, marked the entries made since the funeral. The ink was black, the paper yellowed and smelling faintly of tobacco and cedar. She ran a finger down the column of debts, the feed store, the blacksmith, the bank loan for the new herd of Hereford cattle that Samuel had been so certain would turn their fortune. Samuel had been a man of grand ideas and handsome smiles, but he had left her with a complex web of obligations that she was only just beginning to untangle. The ranch, the Circle 5, was technically hers, but in the eyes of the territory, a woman holding land alone was an anomaly, a problem to be solved rather than a proprietor to be respected. Clara stood up, the chair scraping loudly against the rough floorboards. She walked to the window. Outside, the land rolled away in waves of sagebrush and dry grass, broken only by the dark, skeletal shapes of cottonwood trees along the dry creek bed. The sky was a pale, bruising purple, the color of a healing wound. Winter was coming. She could feel it in the stiffening of the mud in the yard and the way the horses huddled together in the corral, their tails turned to the north. Survival was a series of small, exhausting rituals. She checked the water barrels. She counted the wood pile, calculating if it would last through a blizzard. She spoke to the 2 remaining ranch hands, old men who looked at her with a mixture of pity and doubt, waiting for her to fail so they could move on to a paying job. She wore her black dress like a suit of armor, buttoned to the chin, stiff and scratching against her neck. It was what the town expected. It was the uniform of her new station, the grieving widow, the object of charity, the woman without a protector. But the true threat was not the winter, nor the bank, nor the pity of the townspeople. The true threat arrived 2 days later in a black carriage with red-spoked wheels, drawn by 4 matching bay horses that steamed in the cold morning air. The Vance family had come. They descended from the carriage with the air of royalty inspecting a rebellious province. Jedediah Vance, the patriarch, was a man carved from granite and old leather, his eyes hidden beneath the brim of a white Stetson. He owned the largest spread in the county, the Double Vi, and his influence ran through the valley like a subterranean river, feeding the judge, the sheriff, and the church. Beside him stood his wife, Martha, a woman whose softness had been eroded decades ago, leaving only a sharp, calculating intelligence. And then there was Silas Vance, Samuel's older brother, stepped down last. He was taller than Samuel had been, leaner, with a face that might have been handsome if not for the cold, flat stillness of his eyes. He wore a long duster coat and a dark vest, and he carried a Bible in his pocket as faithfully as other men carried a pistol. Silas did not drink, did not smoke, and did not smile. He collected land and judged souls. Clara met them on the porch. She did not tremble, though her heart hammered against her ribs like a trapped bird. "Father Vance, Mother Vance," Clara said, dipping her head in a gesture that was respectful but not submissive. "Silas, Clara," Jedediah said. His voice was a deep rumble, like thunder rolling in a canyon. "We have come to see to our son's affairs, and to you." "I am managing, sir," Clara said. "The accounts are in order. A woman cannot manage a spread like this alone," Martha said, her voice thin and sharp. "Not with winter coming, not with the wolves at the door." "I have hired help," Clara replied. "Hirelings," Silas said. He stepped up onto the porch, looming over her. He smelled of soap and cold iron. "Men who will rob you blind the moment you turn your head. Samuel is gone. Clara, it is our duty to ensure that what he built is not squandered by inexperience." They did not ask to enter. They simply walked past her into the house. They moved through the rooms, touching the furniture, inspecting the pantry, evaluating the worth of the life she and Samuel had built. It was an invasion, silent and total. They sat in the parlor, the tension thick enough to choke on. Jedediah placed his heavy hands on his knees. "We have discussed the matter with the Reverend and Judge Halloway," Jedediah announced. "It is not right for a woman of your years to be alone. It invites scandal. It invites danger. The scripture is clear on the matter of a widow's protection." Clara felt a chill that had nothing to do with the drafty window. She looked at Silas. He was watching her with a terrifying intensity, a look of possession that had nothing to do with affection. "The law and the Lord agree," Silas said smoothly. "The land must stay in the name. The family must remain whole. I am willing to take on the burden of my brother's widow. I will marry you, Clara. It is the proper order of things." He said it as if he were offering to buy a lame horse out of charity. "Marry?" Clara repeated, the word tasting like ash. "Samuel has been in the ground 3 weeks. The date can be set for after the mourning period softens," Martha said, dismissing the objection with a wave of her gloved hand. "But the engagement must be announced now. To stop the tongues wagging, people are already saying you are overwhelmed, that the ranch is falling into ruin." "I am not overwhelmed," Clara said, her voice rising. "And I do not wish to marry again. I loved Samuel." "Love is a luxury for children," Silas said. He took a step toward her. "This is about survival. Clara, do you think the bank will extend credit to a lone woman? Do you think the cattle rustlers will respect your fences? You are property without a deed. I am offering you the protection of the Vance name. Again." "And if I refuse?" Clara asked. The room went very quiet. Jedediah leaned forward. "Then the bank, which I hold considerable sway over, will call in Samuel's loans immediately," the old man said. "You will be destitute by the first snowfall. You will lose the land, the house, and your reputation. We are offering you a life. Girl, do not be foolish enough to choose poverty." Clara looked at them, the 3 architects of her cage. She saw the truth in their eyes. This was not about protecting her. This was about the land. The Circle 5 had water rights that the Double V needed, and it was about Silas. She had seen the way he looked at her when Samuel was alive, a covetous, simmering resentment. He had wanted Samuel's land, and he had wanted Samuel's wife, simply because they belonged to his brother. "I need time to pray on this," Clara said, her voice barely a whisper. "Pray," Silas said. "God will tell you to obey." The following week, the atmosphere in the town of Bitter Creek shifted. When Clara drove her wagon into town for supplies, she felt the eyes of the townspeople on her. They stood on the boardwalks, wrapped in their coats against the biting wind, and whispered. The Vances had done their work well. The narrative had been set. Poor Clara Vance, barely holding on, hysterical with grief, needing the strong hand of her brother-in-law to save her from ruin. Women she had known for years crossed the street to avoid speaking to her. The shopkeeper, Mr. Henderson, would not meet her eyes as he weighed her flour and coffee. "Put it on the account, please," Clara said. "Mr. Silas Vance stopped by yesterday," Henderson muttered, staring at the counter. "He said all bills for the Circle 5 should go directly to him from now on. He said he is settling your affairs." Clara felt the blood drain from her face. "I did not authorize that." "He is a Vance, ma'am," Henderson said, as if that explained everything. I cannot turn down his money. Clara walked out of the store, her hands trembling. The town felt like a prison yard. The gray sky pressed down, low and suffocating. She walked toward the livery stable where her horses were being shod, needing to be away from the staring eyes. A man was leaning against the wall of the livery, whittling a piece of cedar with a long, curved knife. He wore a battered hat pulled low, and his coat was patched at the elbows. He was lean, with a wire-tough build of a man who lived in the saddle. He looked up as she approached. His face was weathered, mapped with lines from the sun and the wind, and a pale, jagged scar ran from his left cheekbone down to his jaw, disappearing into his beard. It gave him a dangerous look, but his eyes were a surprising, soft brown. Clara recognized him. Elias Thorne. He had worked for the Double V 2 years ago. He had been one of their best breakers, a man who could gentle a horse without breaking its spirit. But he had left suddenly. The rumor was he had refused an order from Silas to run off a sodbuster family who had settled too close to the Vance waterlines. Silas had beaten him, or tried to, and Elias had walked away. Since then, he drifted, picking up day work, living on the fringes of the respectable society that the Vances ruled. Mrs. Vance, Elias said. He did not tip his hat, but his voice was respectful. It was a low, gravelly sound. Mr. Thorne, Clara said, pausing. She did not know why she stopped. Perhaps because he was the only person in town who did not look at her with pity or judgment. He looked at her with a calm, steady assessment. Looks like a hard winter coming, Elias said. He folded his knife and slipped it into his pocket. It does, Clara replied. I heard about Samuel, he said. He was a good man, mostly, better than the stock he came from. Thank you, Clara said. Elias glanced toward the end of the street, where Silas's black carriage was parked in front of the lawyer's office. I hear talk, ma'am. Talk that Silas is looking to expand his holdings. Clara stiffened. That is a family matter. With the Vances. Nothing is a family matter, Elias said. It is a county matter. Silas Vance does not take no for an answer. He takes what he wants. Why are you telling me this? Clara asked. Because I know what it is like to be under their boot. Elias said. He looked at her, and for a moment, the distance between them vanished. He saw the panic she was hiding behind her rigid posture. He saw the trapped animal in her eyes. There are trails out of this valley, Mrs. Vance, trails that do not go past the Double V. The high pass is still open, but only for another week or two. Once the snow flies, this bowl is sealed shut until spring. It was a strange thing to say. It was not advice, exactly. It was information. It was an open door offered to a prisoner. I have nowhere to go, Clara said, her voice tight. Everyone has somewhere to go, Elias said softly. The question is whether they have the nerve to leave. He pushed off the wall and walked away, moving with a loose-limbed grace, disappearing into the shadows of the stable. Clara watched him go, her heart pounding. He had seen her. He had seen the truth of her situation when everyone else saw only a widow doing her duty. 2 days later, Silas returned to the Circle 5. He came alone this time. Clara was in the barn, pitching hay to the horses. The physical labor was the only thing that kept her mind from eating itself. She wore a heavy canvas coat and men's work gloves. Silas stood in the doorway, blocking the light. The dust motes danced around him. This is no work for a lady, he said. The work must be done. Silas, Clara said, not stopping. He walked over and took the pitchfork from her hands. He was strong, his grip overpowering hers easily. He set the tool aside and took her gloved hands in his. It ends now, he said. The banns have been read. The wedding will be this Sunday. A small ceremony. Just the family. Sunday. Clara pulled her hands away. That is 3 days away. Silas, I have not agreed to this. You have no choice. Clara, Silas said. His voice dropped, becoming intimate and terrifying. I have paid Samuel's debts. Every penny. You own nothing. The clothes on your back are mine. The roof over your head is mine. You are mine. He reached out and touched her face, his thumb tracing the line of her jaw. His skin was cold. You should be grateful, I am saving you from the gutter, and in time, you will learn to be a good wife, an obedient wife. Samuel was too soft with you. He let you think you had a voice. I will correct that." Clara stood frozen. The threat was no longer veiled in religious language. It was naked aggression. He was claiming her as he would claim a stray heifer. "I will not be a prisoner in my own home," she said, her voice trembling with rage. "It is not your home," Silas said calmly. "It is my brother's house, and now it is mine." He turned to leave. "Mother has sent Mrs. Gable to stay with you until the ceremony, to help you with your dress, and to ensure you do not do anything rash. She will be here within the hour." Silas paused at the door. "Do not try to leave. Clara, the sheriff has been told that you are unwell, disturbed by grief. If you are found wandering, you will be brought back to me for your own safety, and the high country is full of wolves." He left her standing in the darkening barn, the smell of hay and old leather filling her nose. Clara sank down onto a bale of hay. The trap had snapped shut. Mrs. Gable was a sour-faced woman who acted as the eyes and ears of Martha Vance. She would be a jailer. Sunday, 3 days. She thought of the map she had hidden under her mattress. She thought of the little money she had managed to squirrel away in a coffee tin, coins she had saved from selling eggs and butter. Money Silas did not know about. It was not enough. Not nearly enough. And then she thought of the cowboy at the livery stable, Elias Thorne, the man with the scar and the quiet voice. The high pass is still open. She walked to the barn door and looked out at the vast, indifferent landscape. The wind was picking up again, howling down from the peaks, carrying the scent of ice. The land was huge, terrifyingly empty, capable of killing a person in a single night of exposure. To run was madness. To run was suicide. But as she looked toward the road where Mrs. Gable's buggy would soon appear, Clara realized something with the crystal clarity of the doomed. Staying was a death. Too, it was a death of the soul. Silas would crush her by inches, day by day, until there was nothing left but a shell that cooked his meals and warmed his bed. She looked toward the mountains. They were jagged teeth against the sky, white-capped and forbidding. Somewhere up there was a pass. Somewhere. There was a trail that did not belong to the Vances. She went back into the house, her movements sharp and decisive. She took the ledger from the desk and threw it into the fireplace. She watched the pages curl and blacken, the columns of debt turning to smoke. She would not wait for Sunday. But she could not do it alone. She needed a guide. She needed someone who knew the land better than the wolves. She needed the man who had looked at her and seen a person, not a possession. Clara sat down at the kitchen table and pulled a scrap of paper from her pocket. She wrote 3 words. "I am ready." She folded the paper tight. When the boy from the general store came to deliver the weekly flour, she would slip it into his hand with a nickel and a whisper, "For Elias Thorne." At the livery. Outside. The wind screamed, rattling the bones of the house. The sun dipped below the horizon, plunging the world into a cold, blue twilight. The Vances thought they had won. They thought they had boxed her in with laws and debts and scriptures, but they had forgotten that a cornered thing does not always surrender. Sometimes it bites. Sometimes it runs into the storm. Clara smoothed her black dress, sat in the high-backed chair, and waited for her jailer to arrive. Her face was a mask of grief, but under her ribs, her heart was beating a war drum. Part 1 ended not with a scream, but with the click of the front door latch as Mrs. Gable walked in, carrying a carpet bag and a look of grim determination. "The Lord giveth, and the Lord taketh away," Mrs. Gable said, hanging her coat on the hook. "I am here to see you ready for your wedding, Mrs. Vance." "Thank you, Mrs. Gable," Clara said, her voice steady, her eyes fixed on the fire. "I am sure I will be ready." She was counting the hours. She was counting the miles. She was betting her life on a scar-faced cowboy and the mercy of the winter wind. The correspondence between the widow and the cowboy was not written in ink, for ink could be traced. But in the imperceptible language of the desperate, it lived in the crushing of a dry leaf left on a fence post, the specific arrangement of stones near the water trough, and a single, crumpled note hidden inside a sack of feed delivered to the barn, written on the back of a sugar wrapper with a piece of burnt charcoal. Thursday, 3 hours before dawn. The North Ridge. It was a pact made in silence, binding two strangers who shared nothing but a mutual understanding of what it meant to be owned by the Vance family. Inside the ranch house, the air remained stiflingly hot, fed by the cast-iron stove and the suffocating presence of Mrs. Gable. The older woman was a sentinel of propriety, sitting in the corner of the parlor with her knitting needles clicking like the mandibles of a large insect. She watched Clara with eyes that were beady and wet, looking for any sign of hysteria or rebellion. Clara gave her none. For 2 days, Clara played the part of the defeated woman perfectly. She sat by the window, hands folded in her lap, staring blankly at the horizon. She allowed Mrs. Gable to fit the wedding dress, a heavy, stiff silk gown that had belonged to Silas's first wife, who had died in childbirth 5 years prior. It smelled of lavender and old sweat. Clara stood still as Mrs. Gable pinned the waist tighter, muttering about how grief had made Clara too thin, how a few weeks of Silas's table would put meat back on her bones. But in the quiet hours, when Mrs. Gable slept with the door to her room propped open to hear the slightest creak, Clara was making her preparations. The decision of what to take was a brutal lesson in the weight of a life. She stood before her open wardrobe in the dead of night, the moonlight spilling across the floor in a silver pool. She looked at the dresses Samuel had bought her, velvets from St. Louis, lace from New Orleans. They were beautiful, heavy things, bought to display his prosperity. To take them was impossible. To leave them was to acknowledge that the woman who wore them was dead. She reached for a pair of sturdy woolen trousers that had belonged to Samuel when he was younger and thinner. She found a heavy flannel shirt and a sheepskin coat that smelled of horse and tobacco. She pulled on thick woolen socks and her sturdiest leather boots. On the vanity table sat a silver hairbrush, a wedding gift from her parents back in Ohio. It was heavy, engraved with her maiden initials. It was the only thing in the room that truly belonged to her history. Clara picked it up, feeling the cool metal against her palm. It was valuable. It could be sold. Then she set it back down. She was not running to a market. She was running for her life. The silver was dead weight. The memories attached to it were of a girl who believed that marriage was a fairy tale, and that girl had no place in the high country winter. She took only a small hunting knife, a box of matches, a coil of rope, and the revolver Samuel had kept in the nightstand drawer, a heavy Colt Navy model. She checked the cylinder. 6 rounds. She wrapped it in a rag and shoved it into her belt. The house was silent, save for the rhythmic snoring of Mrs. Gable down the hall and the settling groans of the timber against the wind. It was 3 in the morning. The world outside was a void of black and gray. Clara moved through the kitchen, her boots in her hand to silence her steps. She stopped at the back door. Her heart was beating so hard she felt it in her throat, a frantic, thumping rhythm. If she opened this door, there was no returning. If she was caught now, Silas would not wait for Sunday. He would lock her in the cellar. He would break her spirit with the efficiency of a man breaking a colt. She gripped the iron handle. It was freezing cold. She turned it slowly, praying the hinges had been greased recently. The door opened with a soft sigh of protesting metal. The wind hit her instantly, a physical slap of cold air that stole the breath from her lungs. It was bitter, smelling of sage and ice. It was the smell of the indifferent earth. Clara slipped out, closing the door behind her. She sat on the frozen step and pulled on her boots, her fingers fumbling with the laces in the dark. She did not look back at the house. She did not look at the window where she had spent 3 years waiting for a happiness that never arrived. She turned her collar up against the wind and ran toward the barn shadows, moving low, a ghost in her own yard. The coyotes were yipping in the distance, a maniacal, laughing sound that echoed off the canyon walls. It was a lonely sound, wild and hungry. Clara felt a kinship with them. She, too, was now a creature of the dark, hunting for survival. She skirted the edge of the corral, avoiding the sleeping bunkhouse where the hired men lay. The ground was hard as iron, crunching softly under her boots. Every noise sounded like a gunshot in the stillness. She reached the perimeter fence, climbed through the rails, and dropped into the dry creek bed that led toward the north ridge. The walk was 2 miles, uphill, in the dark. The cold seeped through her layers, finding the gaps in her coat, numbing her nose and ears. She forced herself to keep a steady pace, counting her steps to keep the panic at bay. 1, 2, 3, breathe. 1, 2, 3, breathe. By the time she reached the cluster of boulders at the base of the north ridge, her lungs burned and her legs felt heavy as lead. The darkness was absolute here, the moon obscured by a bank of thick, low clouds. "Mrs. Vance," a voice said from the shadows. Clara spun around, her hand dropping instinctively to the heavy weight of the revolver at her waist. Elias Thorne stepped out from behind a scrub oak. He was holding the reins of 2 horses. The animals were saddled and packed, their breath steaming in the air like dragon smoke. Elias wore a long canvas duster and a hat pulled low. He did not look like a hero. He looked like a shadow that had decided to speak. "Mr. Thorne," Clara whispered. "Elias," he corrected gently. "If we are to survive this, we cannot stand on ceremony." He looked at her, his eyes adjusting to the gloom. He saw the trousers, the heavy coat, the determined set of her jaw. He nodded, a small, almost imperceptible movement of approval. "You traveled light," he said. "I took what I could carry." Clara replied, Is that horse for me?" "This is Blue," Elias said, patting the neck of a sturdy roan mare. "She is not fast, but she is sure-footed. She will not spook in the snow. Do you know how to ride astride?" "I can learn," Clara said. "We have a long way to go before sunup." Elias said. He did not offer to help her up. He did not treat her like porcelain. He held the stirrup steady and waited. Clara grabbed the saddle horn and hauled herself up. It was ungraceful, and the leather was cold and hard, but she was mounted. She felt a strange surge of power, sitting high above the ground, the reins in her hands. "Which way?" she asked. "North," Elias said, swinging onto his own mount, a tall bay gelding. "Into the teeth of the wind. It is the last place they will look for a woman." They rode in silence. The wind howled around them, drowning out the sound of the hooves. The land rose sharply, the sagebrush giving way to pine and juniper. The air grew thinner, sharper. For the first hour, Clara was consumed by terror. Every shadow looked like Silas. Every snap of a twig sounded like a rifle bolt. She kept waiting for the shout, for the thunder of the Vance family's thoroughbreds behind them. But there was only the wind and the rhythmic creak of leather. As the adrenaline faded, a new fear took root. She was alone in the wilderness with a man who was practically a stranger, a man with a scar and a history of violence. She had entrusted her life to him based on a look in his eyes and a few whispered words. The town would call her a fallen woman. They would say she had run off with a hired hand, that she was no better than a harlot. She glanced at Elias. He was riding a few lengths ahead, his posture relaxed but alert. He checked the back trail constantly, his head turning, scanning the darkness. He did not look at her with hunger or judgment. He looked at her as he looked at the trail, as something that needed to be navigated with care. After 3 hours, the sky to the east began to bruise with a dull, gray light. They had climbed high enough that the snow was no longer just in patches. It covered the ground in a thin, crusty blanket. Elias pulled his horse up and waited for her to come alongside. "We need to rest the horses," he said. "Just for a moment. And you need water." He handed her a canteen. Clara took it, her gloves stiff with cold. She drank. The water was freezing and tasted of tin, but it was wonderful. "Are you all right?" Elias asked. He was looking at her face, watching for signs of frostbite. "I'm cold," Clara admitted. "And I'm afraid—" "Good," Elias said. "Fear keeps you sharp. The cold is just a fact." We will find shelter before nightfall." "Where are we going?" Clara asked. "There is an old line shack near the crest of the pass." Elias said, "Used to be used by trappers before the cattle moved in. It is rough, but it has 4 walls and a stove. We can wait out the storm there." "Storm?" Clara looked up at the sky. It was a flat, heavy sheet of iron. "It smells like snow." Elias said, "Big snow. It will cover our tracks, but it will slow us down." He paused, shifting in his saddle. "Clara, I need to ask you something, and I need you to answer me true. Yes? If you want to turn back, we can do it now," Elias said. "We can say you got lost, confused by grief. I will take the blame. I will say I found you wandering and brought you home. Silas will be angry, but you will be safe from the winter." Clara stared at him. The wind whipped a lock of hair across her face. "Why would you offer that?" "Because I am not your jailer," Elias said, his voice low and intense. "I am not Silas. I will not force you down this trail. This is your life. You have to choose it. Every mile. You have to choose it." Clara looked back the way they had come. Down there, in the valley, was warmth. There was food. There was a big house and a powerful family. And there was a cage. A cage made of gold and scripture, but a cage nonetheless. She looked at Elias. He was giving her the one thing no man had ever given her, the right to refuse. "I am not going back," Clara said firmly. "I would rather freeze on this mountain than go back to that house." Elias nodded. A slow, solemn movement. "Then we ride." They pushed on. The snow began to fall around noon. Small, hard pellets that stung the skin. By mid-afternoon, it was a curtain of white, reducing the world to a radius of 20 feet. The temperature plummeted. Clara's hands were numb inside her gloves. Her legs ached with a dull, throbbing pain from the unfamiliar riding. She felt small, insignificant against the sheer scale of the mountains. The wind roared through the pines like a freight train. Just as she thought she could not hold on any longer, a shape loomed out of the whiteness. It was a low, squat cabin built of rough logs, half buried in a drift. "We are here," Elias shouted over the wind. They dismounted. Clara's knees buckled when her feet hit the ground. But Elias was there, catching her by the elbow, steadying her without crowding her. They led the horses into a lean-to shelter attached to the side of the cabin, protecting them from the worst of the wind. Elias worked quickly, unsaddling the horses, rubbing them down with dry straw, covering them with blankets. He moved with an economy of motion that was beautiful to watch. Only when the animals were cared for did he turn to the cabin door. He kicked away the snow and pushed it open. Inside, it was dark and smelled of ancient wood smoke and rat droppings. But it was out of the wind. Elias found a lantern hanging from a nail and lit it. The dim yellow light revealed a single room with a rusted iron stove, a broken table, and 2 bunks with rotting mattresses. "Luxury," Elias muttered. He went to work on the stove. There was a small pile of dry wood in the corner. Within minutes, he had a fire crackling. The metal of the stove ticked and pinged as it heated up. Clara stood by the fire, shivering uncontrollably. The warmth began to thaw her frozen limbs, bringing a stinging pain to her fingers and toes. "Sit," Elias said, pulling a crate near the stove. "Get those boots off. You need to get the blood moving." He did not offer to take them off for her. He busied himself with the saddlebags, pulling out a tin of beans and a bag of coffee. He treated her with a careful distance, as if she were a wild bird that might fly into the wall if he moved too fast. They ate in silence, sharing the tin of beans. The food was hot and salty, and to Clara, it tasted better than any roast dinner served at the Vance table. "You knew this place was here," Clara said, wrapping her hands around a tin cup of coffee. "I spent a winter up here once." Elias said, "Before I worked for the Vances, trapping beaver." "Why did you leave the Vances, Elias?" she asked. "The town says you were fired for drinking." Elias looked at her across the glow of the stove. The scar on his face seemed deeper in the firelight. "The town says what Silas tells them to say. He took a sip of coffee. I was not fired. I quit. Silas wanted the water rights to the Miller place. Old man Miller wouldn't sell. Silas told me and 2 others to go up there and encourage him. He wanted us to burn his barn, poison his well. Clara felt a cold knot in her stomach. And you refused. I did, Elias said. But the others didn't. I tried to stop them. That's where I got this. He touched the scar on his cheek. Silas's foreman hit me with a shovel. I woke up in a ditch 2 days later. The Miller barn was ashes. The family was gone. He looked down at his hands. I should have done more. I should have gone to the law. But the law belongs to Jedediah. So I walked away. I have carried that shame for 2 years. Clara, I served men who eat the weak. I took their coin. Clara reached out, her hand hovering near his arm but not touching. You are not like them. Elias, you are here. You are helping me. I am trying to balance the ledger, Elias said quietly. But I am not sure it can be balanced. It can, Clara said. Her voice was soft but fierce. My husband? Samuel was not cruel like Silas, but he was weak. He saw what his family did, and he looked away. He bought me dresses to cover the silence. I was lonely. Elias, even in his bed, I was lonely. I was a doll in a glass cabinet. You see me. You are the first person in 3 years who has looked at me and seen a human being. Elias looked up. His brown eyes locked onto hers. In the small, smoke-stained cabin, the air between them shifted. It was no longer just the camaraderie of survival. It was something charged, something fragile and terrifying. He reached out slowly and covered her hand with his. His palm was rough, calloused, but his touch was incredibly gentle. You are not a doll. Clara, he said. You are made of iron. I saw you climb that ridge. I saw you leave your life behind without a tear. You are stronger than any Vance who ever lived. Clara felt a warmth spread through her chest that had nothing to do with the stove. She turned her hand over, interlacing her fingers with his. It was a small intimacy, but it felt monumental. It was a claim of agency. She was choosing to touch him. Thank you, she whispered. They sat like that for a long time, listening to the wind scream outside. 2 refugees huddled against the dark, 5,000 feet below. In the parlor of the Circle 5, the silence had been shattered. Silas Vance stood in the center of Clara's bedroom. The wardrobe doors were flung open. The bed was empty. The silver hairbrush sat on the vanity, mocking him. He held the note that Mrs. Gable had found tucked into the frame of the mirror. It was not an apology. It was not a plea. It was a land deed, signed over to the church, effective immediately upon her death or disappearance. A final act of defiance to complicate the legal claim to the land. But Silas did not care about the land deed in that moment. He cared about the theft. His face was a mask of cold, white fury. He did not shout. He did not throw things. He became very, very still. She has run! Mrs. Gable blubbered from the doorway, wringing her handkerchief. I only closed my eyes for a moment. Silas, I swear. Quiet, Silas said. His voice was a razor. He walked to the window and looked out at the storm raging in the high country. He knew where she would go. There was only one way out when the snows came. He turned to the ranch foreman, who stood uneasily in the hall. Saddle the horses, Silas said. Get the men, not the old ones, the hard ones. Get the trackers. Boss, there's a blizzard blowing in up top, the foreman said. We'll lose the trail. She is a woman on a plow horse, Silas said. She will not get far. And she is not alone. Someone helped her. Someone knew the patrols. He walked to the wall and took down a Winchester rifle. He levered the action, checking the chamber. I want them found, Silas said. I want him dead, and I want her intact. She has a wedding to attend on Sunday. It's a bad night for a ride. Silas, the foreman pressed. Silas turned his cold eyes on the man. It is a matter of honor, Mr. Grady, and for honor. We will ride into hell itself. The posse formed within the hour. 6 men, heavily armed, riding the best horses money could buy. They thundered out of the Circle 5 yard, their coats flapping in the gale, heading toward the mountains. Up in the line shack, Clara woke with a start. The fire had burned down to embers. Elias was awake, standing by the frosted window, peering out through a crack in the boards. "What is it?" Clara asked. Sitting up, "The wind has shifted," Elias said quietly. "And I heard something. Not a coyote." He turned to look at her, and his face was grim. The gentle moment of the evening was gone, replaced by the hard reality of the hunt. "They are coming, Clara," he said. "Silas is coming." Clara stood up, wrapping the blanket around her shoulders. The fear was there, yes, but underneath it was the steel she had found on the ridge. "Then let them come," she said. "We have the high ground, and I'm not going back." Elias nodded, reaching for his rifle. "No, we are not." The escape was over. The war had begun. The high country of the Wyoming Territory did not welcome travelers. It tolerated them with a cold, stony indifference that could turn lethal in the span of a single hour. For 3 days, Clara Vance and Elias Thorne moved through a landscape that seemed determined to erase them. They rode along wind-carved ridges where the pine trees grew twisted and low, hugging the rock to escape the gale. They navigated snow-slick passes where a single misstep meant a fall of 1,000 feet into the granite teeth of the canyons below. The blizzard that had covered their escape from the line shack had passed, leaving behind a world of blinding white and shadow. The air was so cold it felt solid in the lungs, burning on the inhale and crystallizing on the exhale. Clara rode the roan mare, Blue, with a grim determination that replaced her earlier terror. The fear was still there, sitting in the pit of her stomach like a cold stone. But she had learned to pack it down, layer by layer, beneath the necessity of survival. She learned that the cold did not care if she was a widow or a wife or a fugitive. It only cared if she kept moving. On the 4th afternoon, they stopped to rest the horses in a copse of aspen trees. The white trunks looked like bone against the snow. Elias dismounted, his movements stiff. He watched Clara slide from her saddle. She landed heavily but kept her feet. "You are riding better," Elias observed. He was checking the cinch on his bay gelding, his breath steaming in the air. "I am riding because walking takes too long," Clara said. She reached into her saddlebag and pulled out the strip of dried beef they were rationing. She took a knife, her husband's knife, and sawed it into 2 equal portions. She handed the larger piece to Elias. He looked at it, then at her. "I am fine with less." "You are breaking trail," Clara said, her voice raspy from the dry air. "The horses work harder in the front, and so do you." "Eat it, Elias." He took the meat. There was a shift in his eyes, a flicker of respect that went beyond the courtesy due a woman. She was no longer just the package he was delivering to safety. She was a partner in the hardship. "We need to clean the rifles tonight," Clara said, chewing the tough jerky. "The moisture from the snow is getting into the actions. Show me how to strip the bolt on the Winchester." "It is greasy work," Elias warned. "I have gutted chickens and birthed calves." "Elias," Clara said, meeting his gaze, "I think I can handle a little gun oil." That night, by a small, smokeless fire built in the shelter of a rock overhang, he taught her. She learned the weight of the spring, the smell of the solvent, the click of the metal seating home. She did not flinch at the weapon. It was a tool, no different than a needle or a churn. Except this tool bought distance between her and Silas Vance. The accident happened the next morning. They were descending a narrow game trail that cut across a scree slope above a freezing, fast-moving river. The sun had come out, melting the top layer of snow just enough to turn the rock beneath it into a sheet of glass. Elias was in the lead, leading his horse by the reins, testing the footing. A grouse exploded from the brush, a sudden thunder of wings. Elias's horse reared, its iron shoes sparking against the granite. It slipped sideways, its hindquarters sliding over the edge of the trail. Elias did not let go. He threw his weight back, hauling on the lead rope, shouting a guttural command. He managed to swing the horse's head around, forcing its weight forward, saving the animal from the drop. But the momentum swung him hard against the canyon wall, and then his boot found only air. He tumbled, sliding 20 feet down the sharp shale before slamming into a stunted juniper tree that jutted out over the river. "Elias!" Clara screamed. She was off her horse before it had fully stopped. She scrambled down the slope, disregarding the tearing of her coat and the rocks slicing her palms. Elias was lying tangled in the roots of the juniper. His face was gray, drained of blood, and his left leg was twisted at a sickening angle below the knee. A jagged tear in his trousers showed dark, welling blood. "Don't move," Clara commanded, her voice shaking but loud. "The horse!" Elias gasped, his teeth gritted in pain. "Is the horse sound?" "The horse is fine," Clara snapped. "You are the fool who fell." She reached him and anchored herself against the tree trunk. The drop to the river was 50 feet straight down. If he slipped from the roots, he was gone. "I can climb up," Elias wheezed. He tried to push himself up, but as soon as he put weight on the leg, he cried out, a raw sound that was swallowed by the wind. He slumped back, sweat beading instantly on his forehead despite the freezing temperature. "You cannot climb," Clara said. "And I cannot carry you." She looked up at the trail. It was steep, but the rope on her saddle was long. "Listen to me," Clara said, grabbing his face with both hands to force him to look at her. His eyes were unfocused with pain. "I am going to get the rope. I am going to tie it to the saddle horn. I will lower it to you. You tie it around your chest. Blue will pull you up. Do you understand?" "Clara, do you understand?" she shouted. "Yes," he whispered. The next hour was a blur of exhausting, frantic labor. Clara backed the roan mare to the edge of the trail. She scrambled down, tied the rope around Elias, scrambled back up. She spoke to the horse in a low, steady stream of nonsense. Keeping the animal calm, she guided the pull, watching the rope strain, praying the knot would hold. When Elias finally crested the edge of the trail and rolled onto the flat, safe ground, Clara collapsed beside him, her lungs burning like fire, but she did not stay down. She cut the pant leg open. The gash was deep, but it had missed the artery. The knee was swollen to the size of a melon, but not broken. "I need to sew this," Clara said, looking at the cut. "Do you have whiskey?" Elias asked weakly. "No," Clara said, "but I have a needle." She stitched the wound with a thread from her sewing kit, her hands steady despite the adrenaline crashing through her system. Elias did not scream, but he gripped a handful of snow so hard his knuckles turned white. When she was done, she splinted the leg with 2 straight branches and strips of cloth from her petticoat, a garment she had begun to hate for its weight, but which now saved him. "We cannot ride far," Clara said, wiping her bloody hands on the snow. "You can't sit a saddle like this for long." "There is a valley," Elias murmured, his eyes closed. 5 miles east, hidden, there is water, grass. Then we go east," Clara said. She helped him mount, using a rock as a step, letting him lean his entire weight on her small frame. She gritted her teeth under the burden. She was no longer the widow Vance. She was the leader of this expedition. They reached the valley at dusk. It was a bowl of land protected from the wind, where the snow was thinner, and there, rising from a grove of cottonwoods, was a thin trail of smoke. Elias pulled his rifle from the scabbard, but Clara put a hand on his arm. "No," she said. "If they wanted to kill us, they would have done it when we crested the ridge. Look." She pointed. Standing near the trees were 3 men holding carbines, but their barrels were pointed at the ground. They wore wide-brimmed sombreros and heavy woolen serapes. Behind them was a flock of sheep, huddled together in a pen made of brush. "Pastores," Elias whispered. "Sheep herders, likely from New Mexico, up here for the late graze." Clara rode forward, her hands visible and empty. She stopped 10 yards from the men. "My friend is hurt," she called out. "We need shelter. We have no money, but we have strong horses and we mean no harm." The oldest of the men stepped forward. His face was a map of deep wrinkles, darker than a saddlebag. He looked at Clara, then at the swaying, pale figure of Elias. "The storm comes again tonight. the man said in heavily accented English. "A man with a bad leg will freeze. Come." They were given a corner of a large canvas tent that smelled of lanolin, sage smoke, and unwashed bodies. It was the warmest place Clara had ever known. The group was a family, a grandfather, 2 sons, and a young woman with a baby who watched Clara with wide, dark eyes. They were Nuevo Mexicanos, people who had been on this land before the maps were drawn in Washington, before the fences of the Vance Empire cut the world into squares. They existed on the margins, moving like ghosts through the territory, tolerated when they were invisible and chased off when they were not. For 2 days, they rested there. The grandmother of the family, a woman with hands like twisted roots, made a poultice of crushed leaves and foul-smelling grease for Elias's leg. She murmured prayers over him while Clara fed him broth. On the second night, the fever broke. Elias was sitting up, leaning against a saddle, watching the fire. The grandfather, whose name was Mateo, sat across from him, smoking a corn-husk cigarette. "You run from the law?" Mateo asked. It was not an accusation, merely a question of logistics. "We run from a family that thinks they are the law," Elias answered. Mateo nodded slowly. "The Vances. We know the brand. They hanged 3 of my cousins in '74, accused them of stealing cattle. My cousins were sheep herders. They did not want cattle, but the Vances wanted the water." Clara sat in the shadows, listening. She looked at the young woman rocking her baby. She saw the poverty of their camp, the worn tools, the carefully patched clothes. And she saw the dignity. They were hunted, marginalized, treated as less than human by men like her father-in-law. "I lived in their house," Clara said softly. The men turned to look at her. "I ate their food, I wore their silk, and I never asked where the water came from." "You did not know, Senora," Mateo said kindly. "I did not ask," Clara corrected. "That is a sin of its own." Later, when the camp was asleep, Clara sat beside Elias. He was looking better, the color returning to his cheeks. The intimacy of the small tent forced them close. "Mateo is right," Elias said, his voice low. "The Vances have a long reach and a long memory. Why did you really come back for me?" "Elias," Clara asked. "You were free of them. You could have been in Montana by now." Elias looked at the canvas roof. "I saw Samuel 2 days before he died, up near the north pasture." Clara stiffened. "He was checking the fence line. He was arguing with Silas," Elias said. "I was riding the ridge, looking for strays. I saw them. Silas was angry. He was shouting about the deed to the section near the creek. Samuel was shaking his head. He was standing up to him. Clara, for the first time." "Samuel never stood up to Silas," Clara said, but a doubt pricked at her heart. "He did that day," Elias insisted. "And 2 days later, Samuel's horse throws him on a trail he had ridden 1,000 times, a horse that was bomb-proof. You think—" Clara could not finish the sentence. "I think Silas saw a brother who was finally growing a spine," Elias said. "And I think Silas saw a widow who came with a deed attached, a widow he could break." Clara felt a coldness that had nothing to do with the winter. "He killed him. He killed his own brother for land. And for you," Elias added softly. "Do not underestimate his want for you. Clara, it is not just about the ranch. I have seen the way he watches you in church, like a wolf watching a lamb." Clara looked at Elias. The firelight danced in his eyes. He was scarred, battered, and hunted because of her. And yet, he was the only thing in the world that felt true. "I am not a lamb," Clara whispered. "No," Elias said. "You are not." He reached out and took her hand. This time, he did not let go. The distance that had been between them, the distance of class, of propriety, of the widow and the hired hand, evaporated. "I have nothing to offer you. Clara," Elias said, "my name is dirt in this county. I have $1 in my pocket and a price on my head." "I do not want your money," Clara said. She moved closer, until her shoulder pressed against his. "I was married to a rich man. Elias, I was married to a man with a fine name, and I froze to death in his bed every night." She turned to face him. The space between them was charged with the electricity of a storm. "I want to be warm," she said. "I want to be seen." Elias lifted his hand and touched her face, his thumb tracing the line of her cheekbone. I see you, Clara. I have seen you since the day you arrived in Bitter Creek. You were the only thing in that gray town that had any color. She leaned into his touch. It was a surrender, but it was also a victory. She kissed him. It was not the chaste, dutiful kiss of a wife greeting a husband. It was desperate and sweet, tasting of coffee and wood smoke. It was a reclaiming of her own body, a declaration that she belonged to no one but herself. When he pulled her down onto the blankets beside him, careful of his injured leg, there was no shame in the dark. There was only the heat of two people who had found a fire in the middle of a vast, frozen emptiness. They held each other with a fierce tenderness, whispering fears and longings that had been buried under years of silence. I am afraid, Clara admitted against his neck. So am I, Elias answered. Good, she echoed his earlier words. Fear keeps us sharp. The morning brought a cold, hard light and a visitor to the camp. One of Mateo's sons had ridden to the trading post at the crossroads, 10 miles away. He returned with a sack of cornmeal and news that made the blood run cold. He sat by the fire, his face grave. There are posters, the son said, in the store window. A reward, $500 for the man who kidnapped the widow Vance, dead or alive. Kidnapped? Clara said, her voice rising. I left of my own will. The paper says you were taken by force, the son continued. It says you are hysterical, sick in the mind. The judge has signed a warrant, and the sheriff has deputized men from the Double V. They are turning the law into a weapon, Elias said, rubbing his injured leg. If we run to California, they will follow. If we go to Oregon, the telegraph will be waiting. A kidnapping charge. That hangs a man. And it locks a woman in an asylum, Clara said quietly. That is his plan. If I refuse to marry him, he will have me declared incompetent. He will take the ranch as my guardian. She stood up and walked to the edge of the camp. She looked west, toward the passes that led to freedom. It was a vast, open country, but it was a trap. As long as the lie stood, she would never be free. She would always be the mad widow, the victim, the property. She turned back to Elias. He was watching her, and he already knew what she was thinking. He knew it because he was the same kind of stubborn. We cannot run enough miles to outrun a lie, Clara said. Elias nodded. He reached for his rifle and began to wipe it down with a rag. No, we cannot. We have to go back, Clara said. The words felt heavy, like stones, but they settled into place with a terrifying rightness. We have to go back to Bitter Creek. We have to face him. It will be 2 against a town, Elias said. Against the money, the church, and the gun. We have something they don't, Clara said. She touched the pocket of her coat, where she kept the small notebook she had started writing in. Recording dates, debts, and now, the truth about Samuel. What is that? Elias asked. The truth, Clara said. And we are going to drag it into the daylight, if I am to be destroyed. Elias, I will not be destroyed running away. I will be destroyed standing on my own 2 feet, looking Silas Vance in the eye. Elias stood up, testing his leg. It held. He winced, but he smiled. A rare, dangerous smile that lit up his scarred face. Well, he said, checking the load in his Winchester. I always did hate leaving a job unfinished. Clara looked at Mateo. Thank you for the shelter. We leave within the hour. You go to your death, Senora, Mateo said sadly. Maybe, Clara said, swinging onto the roan mare with a grace she had earned in the snow. But at least it will be my own death, and not the one they chose for me. They turned their horses south, back toward the storm, back toward the town of Bitter Creek. They were no longer fugitives running from a nightmare. They were a reckoning, riding home. The journey back to Bitter Creek was a descent from the clarity of the high country into the murky, tangled suffocation of the valley. Clara Vance and Elias Thorne moved like ghosts, trading the open ridges for the shadows of the cottonwood breaks along the serpentine twist of the river. They traveled by night, the moon a sliver of bone in a black sky, guiding their horses through the freezing mud of the riverbanks where the willows grew thick enough to hide a rider. Elias rode with his rifle across his saddle, his left leg stiff and throbbing in the splint Clara had fashioned. He did not complain, but Clara saw the lines of pain etched white around his mouth whenever Blue stumbled on a river stone. They were no longer running, they were hunting. And the prey was the truth. The landscape here was different. It was not the indifferent majesty of the peaks, but a land scarred by ownership. Fences cut across the open range, barbed wire gleaming with frost. Brands were burned into the hide of every calf. It was a world where everything had a master, and to be masterless was to be dangerous. Clara felt the weight of her return pressing on her chest. In the mountains, survival had been simple. Eat, warm the blood, keep moving. Here, the danger was psychological. As they passed the dark outlines of outlying homesteads, she imagined the voices inside. She knew what they were saying. Silas had controlled the narrative. To them, she was not a woman fleeing abuse. She was a harlot who had been seduced by a violent drifter, a woman who had desecrated her husband's memory before the dirt was settled on his grave. "You are quiet," Elias said. His voice was a low rumble, barely audible over the rush of the river water. "I am thinking about what they will call me," Clara admitted. She pulled her sheepskin coat tighter. "They will not listen to a woman they believe has lost her virtue. Elias, in their eyes, my word is worth less than the mud on my boots." "Virtue is just a word men use to keep women in the parlor," Elias said, scanning the tree line. "You have something better than virtue. Clara, you have the truth." "The truth is a quiet thing," Clara replied bitterly. "And Silas has a very loud voice." They needed proof. The notebook Clara carried was a start, a record of dates and Samuel's erratic behavior before his death. But it was the diary of a grieving wife. It could be dismissed as hysteria. They needed something cold and hard, something that did not depend on sentiment. "We need to see Dr. Bennett," Clara said suddenly, pulling her horse up. Elias turned in his saddle. "The town doctor. He is in Silas's pocket." "He is a drunk," Clara corrected. "And he is a coward. But he is not a killer. When Samuel was brought in, when his body was brought to the house, Dr. Bennett would not look me in the eye. He signed the death certificate as an accidental fall without even undressing the body. He was shaking. Elias, if we go to Bennett, we are walking into the edge of town," Elias warned. "If we are seen, we have to risk it," Clara insisted. "If Samuel was murdered, Bennett knows. And if we can make him speak, Silas loses the law." They tied the horses in a dense thicket of chokecherry bushes a mile outside of town. They walked the rest of the way, moving through the back alleys and dry ditches that crisscrossed the settlement. The wind had died down, leaving a heavy, expectant silence over the town. Dogs barked in the distance, setting Clara's nerves on edge. Dr. Amos Bennett lived in a small, clapboard house detached from the main street, with a surgery attached to the rear. A single lamp burned in the window. Elias went first, checking the perimeter. He signaled to Clara, and they slipped to the back door. Elias tried the latch. Locked. He pulled his hunting knife, slid the blade between the jamb and the door, and with a quiet click, the latch lifted. They entered the kitchen. It smelled of stale whiskey and carbolic acid. Dr. Bennett was slumped at his kitchen table, a half-empty bottle of rye before him, his head in his hands. He jumped when the door closed, spinning around, his eyes wide and bloodshot. "Who is there?" he stammered, reaching for a heavy pestle on the table. Elias stepped into the light. He looked terrifying, a week of beard growth, the scar vivid on his cheek, the rifle held loosely in his hand. "Elias Thorne," Bennett breathed, his face draining of color. There is a reward. They say you are a kidnapper." "And what do they say about me? Amos?" Clara stepped out from behind Elias. The doctor stared at her. She looked wild, her hair braided tight, wearing men's trousers and a coat stained with pine pitch. But her eyes were clear and furious. "Mrs. Vance," Bennett whispered, "you should not be here. Silas, he has men patrolling the roads. He has turned the town upside down." "Why did you lie about Samuel?" Clara asked. She did not raise her voice. She walked to the table and placed her hands flat on the wood. I did not lie, Bennett stammered. It was a fall, a tragic fall. Samuel was an expert horseman, Clara said, and the horse he was riding was 14 years old and steady as a rock. Tell me, Amos, did he have a broken neck, or did he have bruises on his face? Did he have defensive wounds on his hands? Bennett looked at the bottle, then at Elias's rifle, then at Clara. He began to weep, a pathetic, wheezing sound. Silas came to me before the body arrived, Bennett confessed, his voice trembling. He told me that Samuel had fallen. He told me that for the sake of the family, for the sake of the town's peace, it had to be a fall. He said if I found anything else, he would see to it that my supply of laudanum was cut off. He owns the freight line. Clara, he owns the pharmacy. Did you write it down? Elias asked, stepping closer. A man like you, Amos, a man of science, you wouldn't just forget what you saw. You would keep a record, just in case Silas decided you were a loose end. Bennett hesitated, then nodded. He stood up on shaking legs and went to a loose floorboard under the stove. He pried it up and pulled out a small, leather-bound ledger. It is all here, Bennett said, handing it to Clara. The bruising on the knuckles, the pattern of the break in the cervical vertebrae. It was not a fall. It was a twisting force. Someone strong did it. Someone he let get close. Clara clutched the book to her chest. It was the key. It was the proof that she was not property, but the widow of a murdered man. You will testify to this, Clara said. I can't, Bennett whimpered. Silas will kill me. If you don't, Elias said, his voice dropping to a gravelly whisper, then you are an accessory to murder, and when the circuit judge comes through, I will make sure he knows it. But if you stand with us, if you speak the truth, the town might forgive a coward who found his courage, but they will never forgive a man who helped kill a brother. Bennett looked at the floor, then nodded. Tomorrow, there is a town council meeting at the church. Silas called it. He wants the council to authorize a county-wide search warrant. He wants to deputize every able-bodied man to hunt you down. Then we will be there, Clara said. They left the doctor shivering in his kitchen and slipped back into the night, but as they moved toward the edge of town, their luck ran thin. They were crossing the alley behind the livery stable when a door swung open. A shaft of yellow light caught them. A man, one of the Vance Ranch hands, a brute named Grady, stepped out, emptying a bucket of water. He froze. He saw Elias. He saw Clara. Well now, Grady grinned, dropping the bucket. Look what the cat's dragged in. Elias moved instantly, shoving Clara behind him. Walk away, Grady. You don't get paid enough to die. I get paid plenty, Grady said, his hand dropping to the pistol at his hip. And the boss has promised $500 for your ears? He didn't draw. Instead, he shouted, Hey, over here, I got him! Shouts erupted from the main street. Doors banged open. The element of surprise was gone. Run! Elias shouted to Clara. The schoolhouse! They sprinted. Elias's limp was pronounced now, slowing him down, but he refused to stop. They scrambled over a fence, tearing through a backyard, the sounds of pursuit gathering like a storm behind them. The schoolhouse sat on a small hill at the edge of town, a white structure that stood apart from the saloons and the stores. They burst through the front door, startling the young woman who was grading papers at the desk by the stove. Sarah Jenkins was the schoolteacher, a woman of 30 who wore her spinsterhood like a badge of independence. She looked up, her spectacles sliding down her nose. She saw the mud, the rifle, the terror. Miss Jenkins, Clara gasped, leaning against the door to bolt it. Please, we need sanctuary. Sarah stood up. She looked at Clara, not with judgment, but with a sharp, assessing intelligence. She looked at the angry torchlights appearing down the hill. Is it true? Sarah asked calmly. Did he kidnap you? No, Clara said, straightening her back. I chose to leave because Silas killed my husband, and he intends to make me a prisoner. Sarah looked at Elias. And you, Mr. Thorne, Are you a desperado?" "I am just a man trying to keep a lady alive, ma'am," Elias said. Sarah nodded once. "Get in the cellar. The trap door is under my desk. Quickly." She moved her heavy oak desk with surprising strength. Elias lifted the trap door, and they descended into the cool, dark earth just as heavy fists pounded on the schoolhouse door. "Miss Jenkins!" It was Grady's voice. "Open up! We saw them run this way!" Clara huddled in the dark, listening. Above them, she heard Sarah open the door. "Mr. Grady!" Sarah's voice was crisp and icy. "Do you make it a habit to pound on a lady's door in the middle of the night? Or is your mother ashamed of you for other reasons?" "We're looking for the widow and the half-breed," Grady growled. "They came this way." "I have been here grading arithmetic for 3 hours." Sarah lied smoothly. "I have seen nothing but my own misery over the Wilson boys' long division. If you want to search my school, you may, but know that I will report your muddy boots to the Reverend and your lack of manners to your employer." There was a pause. The authority of the schoolteacher was a formidable thing in the West. It was the authority of civilization. "Sorry, ma'am," Grady muttered. "We'll check the barn." The footsteps retreated. Above them, the trapdoor opened, and a sliver of light returned. "You can come up," Sarah whispered, "but keep the lights low." That night, they camped on the floor of the schoolhouse. The stove cast a dim, flickering glow. Sarah had given them bread and apples, then retired to her small room at the back, leaving them a rare privacy. The adrenaline of the chase had faded, leaving Clara trembling. She sat with her back against the wall, her knees drawn up. Elias sat opposite her, cleaning his rifle again, his movements rhythmic and soothing. "They call me a whore," Clara said into the silence. She hadn't heard the word explicitly, but she had felt it in Grady's grin. "Tomorrow, in the church, Silas will say it. He will say I laid with you to satisfy a lust. He will twist everything." She looked at Elias. "If I stand up there and say I love you, if I admit that we are together, it will confirm every lie he tells. It will destroy my testimony. They will say I am lying to save my lover." Elias stopped cleaning the gun. He set it down and crawled across the floor to sit beside her. He did not touch her immediately. He waited until she looked at him. "Clara," he said softly, "do you think love is a weakness?" "In a courtroom, yes," she said. "In this town? Yes, you are wrong," Elias said. "Silas has power. He has money. He has fear. But he has nothing real. He is hollow. That is why he needs to own things, to fill that empty space." He took her hand. His grip was warm and rough. "What we have, what we found on that mountain, that is not a scandal. That is the only honest thing in this whole cursed valley. If you stand up there and speak the truth, you don't have to apologize for finding comfort. You don't have to apologize for surviving." "I don't want to be the woman who ruined you," Clara whispered. "They will hang you." "Elias, if they think you touched me, let them try," Elias said. "I am done being afraid of what small men think. I spent my whole life thinking I was dirt because I wasn't a Vance, because I didn't own land. But up there, in the snow, when you looked at me, I felt like a king." He leaned in, his forehead resting against hers. "We go in there tomorrow. We tell the truth. And if they judge us, then let them be damned. But we do not hide what we are." Clara closed her eyes, breathing in the scent of him, gun oil, sweat, and pine. The shame that had been nagging at her, the voice of her mother and the church and the town, began to recede. It was replaced by a fierce, burning clarity. She was not property. She was a woman who had walked through a blizzard. She was a woman who had saved a man's life. She was a woman who had chosen. "Okay," she whispered. "We do not hide." She turned her face to his, and they kissed. It was a slow, deliberate kiss. It was a seal on a pact, in the quiet of the schoolhouse, surrounded by maps of a world that didn't care about them and history books written by men like Silas. They wrote their own history. They found safety not in walls, but in the terrifying, beautiful vulnerability of being fully known by another person. The morning came with the tolling of the church bell. It was a heavy, mournful sound that echoed off the canyon walls. Clara stood up and smoothed her trousers. She washed her face in the basin. She braided her hair tight, pulling it back from her face so that nothing was hidden. She did not have a dress. She did not have a veil. She looked like exactly what she was, a survivor. Elias checked his rifle one last time, then set it down in the corner. "We go unarmed," he said. "If we walk in with guns, they will shoot us down. We have to walk in with nothing but the book." He pointed to the ledger doctor. Bennett had given them. "Are you ready?" Elias asked. Clara took the ledger. She felt the weight of it. She looked at Elias, at the man who had ridden into the storm for her. "I am ready," she said. They walked out of the schoolhouse and down the hill toward the white steeple of the church. The town was gathering. Wagons were pulled up. Men stood in clusters, smoking pipes, their faces grim. Women in bonnets whispered behind their hands. At the steps of the church, Silas Vance stood like a sentinel. He was dressed in his Sunday black, a Bible in his hand. He looked like a statue of judgment. When he saw them approaching, the woman in men's clothes and the limping cowboy, the crowd went silent. The silence rippled out, silencing the dogs and the horses. Silas did not move. He watched them come. His eyes were not filled with love or even concern. They were filled with a cold, predatory triumph. He thought they had come to surrender. He thought the winter had broken them. Clara walked up the steps until she was level with him. She did not lower her eyes. "Clara," Silas said, his voice carrying over the crowd. "You have come home. The Lord is merciful." "I have not come home, Silas," Clara said, her voice clear and ringing in the cold air. "And I have not come for mercy. I have come for justice." She held up the ledger. "And I have brought the bill." The confrontation had arrived. The wind picked up, swirling the dust around their boots, but Clara Vance stood like a mountain, immovable, with the cowboy at her shoulder and the truth in her hands. The double doors of the Bitter Creek Community Church were made of heavy pine, banded with iron, and they swung open with a groan that sounded like a judgment. Clara Vance walked through them not as a penitent, but as a storm front. The air inside was stagnant, smelling of beeswax, damp wool, and the nervous sweat of 100 people packed into the pews. Every head turned. The rustle of fabric and the murmur of voices died instantly, replaced by a silence so profound one could hear the wind scratching against the stained glass windows. Clara walked down the center aisle. She wore the trousers and heavy coat she had lived in for 5 days. Her boots were scuffed and muddy, leaving faint prints on the floorboards. Her hair, usually pinned in the intricate, modest style of a rancher's wife, was pulled back severely, exposing the sharp angles of a face stripped of all softness. Beside her walked Elias Thorne. He did not skulk. He did not hide the rifle he had left leaning against the vestibule wall. His hands were empty, hanging loose at his sides, but his presence was a weapon in itself. He walked with a slight limp, his eyes scanning the room, marking the position of every man who wore a badge or a gun belt. Silas Vance stood at the pulpit. He had been mid-sentence, his voice raised in a sermon about duty and the wayward sheep. His mouth hung open for a fraction of a second before snapping shut. His face, usually pale and composed, flushed with a sudden, dark heat. Behind him, in the front pew, sat Jedediah and Martha Vance. The matriarch stiffened, her black-gloved hands clutching her purse as if it contained the family soul. Jedediah stared at Elias with the look a man gives a wolf that has entered the fold. "Clara," Silas said. His voice was projected to the back of the room, smooth and grieving. "Praise God. You have been returned to us. We feared the worst. We feared this man had dragged you to your ruin." He stepped down from the dais, his hand outstretched, a benevolent shepherd reaching for a lost lamb. "Come away from him, sister. The sheriff is here. You are safe now. Your ordeal is over." Clara stopped 10 feet from him. She did not take his hand. She did not tremble. "My ordeal is not over, Silas," Clara said. Her voice was not loud, but it had a timber of steel that carried to the loft. Because my ordeal was not in the mountains. My ordeal was in your brother's house. A gasp rippled through the congregation. Martha Vance stood up, her face pinched with fury. "Have you no shame?" Martha hissed. "Look at you, dressed like a field hand, standing next to a hired killer. You desecrate your husband's memory." "I am here to honor my husband's memory," Clara replied, turning to face the town. She saw the faces of the shopkeepers, the farmers, the women who had whispered about her for years. "You all know me. You know I have kept the accounts of the Circle 5. You know I have paid my debts. You know I have never spoken out of turn." She reached inside her coat and pulled out the small, leather-bound book Dr. Bennett had given her. "But today I speak," she said. "You were told Samuel died of a fall. You were told his horse stumbled. You were told it was an accident." "It was a tragedy," Silas interrupted, his voice hardening. "Sheriff, arrest that man. He has corrupted a grief-stricken woman. He is twisting her mind against her family." Sheriff Miller, a man with a paunch and eyes that shifted nervously, stepped forward from the side aisle. "Now, Mrs. Vance, you just step aside. Elias Thorne, you're under arrest for kidnapping, and if you touch him..." "Sheriff," Clara said, "you will be arresting the only man in this room who risked his life to save me from a murderer." She opened the book. "This is Dr. Bennett's medical journal, dated October 14th, the day Samuel died." "That is private property," Silas shouted. He took a step toward her, his benevolence vanishing, replaced by a jagged edge of panic. "You stole that!" "I did not steal it," Clara said. "Dr. Bennett gave it to me." She looked toward the back of the church, where the doctor stood, shrinking against the wall, trying to be invisible. "Dr. Bennett," Clara called out. "Stand up." The doctor froze. Every eye in the room pivoted to him. He looked at Silas, who was staring at him with a promise of violence. Then he looked at Elias, who stood stoic and unmoving. Finally, he looked at Clara. Amos Bennett was a weak man. He was a drunk. But in that moment, the weight of the silence broke him open. He shuffled forward, wringing his hat in his hands. "Tell them," Clara commanded. It is true," Bennett stammered. His voice was a dry whisper. He cleared his throat. "The notes are mine." "What do the notes say?" "Amos," Clara asked. "The neck was broken," Bennett said, his voice gaining a tremulous strength. "But not from a fall. The angle was wrong, and there were bruises. On the throat, on the knuckles. Defensive wounds. Samuel Vance did not fall from a horse. He was strangled, and then his neck was snapped." The room erupted. Shouts of denial, shock, and anger bounced off the rafters. Jedediah Vance stood up, his face purple. "Lies! The drunkard lies!" "Why did you sign the death certificate as accidental?" Clara asked, cutting through the noise. "Because Silas told me to," Bennett cried out, pointing a shaking finger at the pulpit. "He told me if I didn't, I would lose my practice." "He told me it was family business." Clara turned back to Silas. The brother stood alone in the center of the aisle. The mask of the pious mourner had slipped completely. He looked cornered, and like any cornered animal, he chose aggression. "She is mad," Silas spat, pointing at Clara. "She is a hysterical woman who has been driven out of her mind by grief and lust. Look at her. She runs off with a saddle tramp, sleeps in the dirt, and comes back here to slander her own kin. She is not fit to testify. She is not fit to manage her own affairs." "I am not your kin," Clara said, "and I am not your property. You killed Samuel because he refused to sign over the water rights to the Double V. You killed him because he finally stood up to you, and you thought I would be easy to break. You thought you could force me into a marriage to cover your crime and steal the deed." "It is my land," Silas screamed. The veneer of religious duty shattered. "It has always been Vance land. Samuel was too weak to hold it. He let squatters and trash encroach on our range. He was giving it away. It was my duty to save the ranch." The confession hung in the air, stark and ugly. He had not denied the killing. He had justified it with the arrogance of a man who believed the world belonged to him by divine right. "And you," Silas sneered, turning his eyes on Elias. "You mongrel. You think you can walk in here and take what is mine? You think you can touch a white woman of standing and live to tell the tale?" Elias stepped forward. The crowd flinched, expecting violence, but Elias did not draw a weapon. He did not raise a fist. He spoke with a voice like grinding stones. "She is not yours, Silas." Elias said, "She never was. A woman is not a head of cattle. You can't put your brand on her and call it love." "Sheriff!" Silas roared. "Do your duty. Shoot him!" The sheriff looked at Silas, then at the doctor, then at the ledger in Clara's hand. He saw the way the townspeople were looking at the Vances, not with fear anymore, but with revulsion. The spell of the family's invulnerability was cracking. I can't do that, Silas," the sheriff mumbled. "Not with what the doc just said." "Then I will do it myself," Silas snarled. He reached inside his coat. "No!" Clara screamed. The chaos that had been simmering boiled over. Silas pulled a snub-nosed revolver, but he did not aim at Elias. He grabbed Clara by the arm, spinning her around, jamming the barrel of the gun against her temple. "Back!" Silas shouted. "Get back! I will send her to join Samuel before I let you ruin me." The church turned into a bedlam of screams. Men scrambled over pews. Elias froze, his hands raising slowly. His eyes locked on Silas's finger on the trigger. "Let her go, Silas," Elias said, his voice calm, terrifyingly steady. "There is no way out of this. I am walking out of here," Silas panted. "And she is coming with me. Anyone follows, she dies." He began to drag Clara backward toward the vestibule. Clara did not struggle. She knew that a single jerk could end her life. She looked at Elias. In her eyes, there was fear. Yes, but there was also a silent command. "Do not let him win." They reached the doors. Silas kicked them open, dragging Clara out into the bright, blinding sunlight of the church steps. The crowd spilled out after them, a tide of black coats and bonnets halting at the bottom of the stairs. Outside, the Vance ranch hands were waiting. Grady and 3 others sat on their horses, confused by the sudden exit. "Grady!" Silas screamed. "Cover me! Shoot the cowboy!" Grady looked at his boss. He saw the gun pressed to the widow's head. He saw the madness in Silas's eyes. He looked at Elias, who had emerged onto the porch, unarmed, staring down the barrel of a murderer's gun. "Boss, let her go," Grady said. He did not raise his rifle. "I said shoot him!" Silas shrieked. "I ain't shooting an unarmed man." "Silas," Grady said, spitting a stream of tobacco juice into the dust. "And I ain't part of killing women. That wasn't in the job description." The posse fractured. The hired gun, men who lived by a rough code of violence, drew the line at cowardice. They lowered their weapons. Silas was alone. "It's over. Silas," Clara said. She could smell his sweat, sour and sharp. "Look around you. No one is afraid of you anymore." "Shut up!" Silas jammed the gun harder against her skin. "I am the law in this valley." "You are nothing," Clara said. And then she moved. It was not a move of strength, but of desperation. She stomped her heel down, driving the hard leather of her boot into Silas's instep with all her weight. At the same moment, she threw her head back, slamming her skull into his nose. Bone crunched. Silas howled, his grip loosening for a fraction of a second. The gun slipped, firing a shot into the porch roof. Clara threw herself forward, tumbling down the stairs into the dirt. Silas staggered, blood gushing from his nose, blinding him. He raised the gun again, aiming blindly at the figure on the ground. "Clara!" Elias roared. He did not run. He launched himself. He covered the distance between the door and the villain in 2 strides, tackling Silas just as the second shot rang out. The bullet tore through the sleeve of Elias's coat, grazing his arm, but he did not feel it. He slammed Silas into the wood of the porch. The revolver skittered across the floorboards. Elias was on top of him. The rage of 2 years, the rage of the beaten, the silenced, the hired hands and the widows surged through his fist. He struck Silas once, a brutal, sickening sound. "That is for the Miller family," Elias growled. He struck him again. That is for Samuel." He raised his fist a third time. Silas was limp, his face a ruin, unconscious and broken. "Elias!" Clara's voice cut through the red haze. She was standing at the bottom of the steps, covered in dust, blood on her forehead, but alive. "Don't," she said. "He is not worth your soul." Elias froze. His fist hovered in the air. He looked down at the man who had terrorized the county. Silas looked small now, pathetic. Elias slowly unclenched his hand. He stood up, his chest heaving. He kicked Silas away from him with disgust. "Sheriff," Elias said, his voice flat. "He is all yours." Sheriff Miller walked up the steps, pulling a pair of iron cuffs from his belt. He looked at Silas, then at Elias. He nodded, a gesture of apology and respect. He cuffed the unconscious man and dragged him up. "I'll take him to the county jail in Laramie," the sheriff announced to the crowd. "Judge Holloway can't help him there." The crowd stood in stunned silence. The wind blew through the town, kicking up dust devils that danced between the wagons. Clara walked up the steps. She stopped in front of Elias. She reached out and touched the torn fabric of his sleeve, where the blood was beginning to soak through. "You are bleeding," she said. "It's just a scratch." Elias said. He looked at her. "You fought back." "I told you," Clara said, her voice trembling now that the danger was past. "I am not a lamb." She turned to face the town. Her eyes found Martha and Jedediah Vance. The old man looked suddenly frail. His empire crumbled by the truth. Martha was weeping, not for Samuel, but for the shame of it. Clara did not gloat. She felt a wave of exhaustion so heavy it almost crushed her. She felt the grief finally crashing in, not the polite, performative grief of the funeral, but the raw, ugly reality of loss. She mourned Samuel, the man who had tried to be good but failed. She mourned the years she had wasted being afraid. She walked past the Vances without a word. She walked to her wagon, which had been brought to town by one of the ranch hands. "I am going home," she said to Elias. "To the Circle 5. "I will ride with you," Elias said. "No," Clara said. The town listened, waiting for the scandal. "You will not ride as my guard, and you will not ride as my hired hand." She looked him in the eye, oblivious to the preacher and the matrons. "You will ride as my partner, if you are willing." Elias took off his hat. He looked at the town that had called him a dog. Then he looked at the woman who called him a partner. "I am willing," he said. They mounted their horses. They did not wait for permission. They did not ask for forgiveness. They turned their backs on the church and rode down the main street, side by side. The town watched them go. There were whispers. Yes, there would always be whispers. The women pursed their lips, and the men shook their heads at the disruption of the natural order. But as Clara and Elias passed, Grady, still sitting on his horse, tipped his hat, and Sarah Jenkins, standing in the doorway of the schoolhouse on the hill, smiled. They rode out of the shadow of the town and into the open country. The wind was still cold, but the sky above was a piercing, limitless blue. The road ahead was not easy. The ranch was in debt. The winter was only beginning. The trial would be long and ugly. But as Clara looked at the horizon, she saw something she had never seen before. She saw her own life, stretching out like the prairie, wild and terrifying and entirely her own. She reached across the space between the horses. Elias reached back. Their hands met, gripping hard, leather against skin, warmth against cold. They did not speak. They simply rode on. Two scarred people building a world out of the wreckage, leaving the silence behind them. The sale of the Circle 5 was not a surrender. It was an exorcism. The ranch, with its sprawling pastures and the house that smelled of Samuel's cigars and Silas's ambition, was too heavy with ghosts to ever truly be a home. Clara Vance signed the deed over to a consortium of cattlemen from Cheyenne 3 weeks after the trial. She signed her name with a steady hand, took the bank draft, and walked out of the lawyer's office without looking back. They moved west, climbing out of the valley floor into the jagged embrace of the Absaroka Range. It was a harder country, a place where the timber grew thick and dark and the peaks stayed capped with snow even in June. They bought a smaller parcel of land in a high basin known as Echo Creek, a place ignored by the cattle barons because the grazing was seasonal and the winters were unforgiving. But to Clara and Elias, the isolation was the point. The cabin they built was not the manor house of a patriarch. It was a structure born of necessity and sweat, raised log by notched log. For the first month, they lived in a canvas wall tent while the snow piled up around them, working from dawn until the light failed to get the roof beam set. Survival in the high country demanded a partnership that left no room for the rigid hierarchies of the town. There was no woman's work or man's work when the blizzard howled and the woodpile grew low. Clara learned to handle the crosscut saw, her muscles hardening, her hands callousing over the soft skin of her former life. Elias learned that he did not have to carry the weight of the world in silence. One evening in late January, the wind outside was a shrieking banshee, rattling the new glass in the window frames. Inside, the iron stove glowed cherry red, casting a warm, flickering light over the single room. Clara sat at the table, mending a tear in Elias's coat. Elias was oiling the leather of a bridle. The domesticity of it was striking because it was so ordinary. Yet every moment of peace felt stolen from the jaws of a wolf. "The flour is getting low," Elias said, not looking up. "I will have to take the wagon down to the crossing tomorrow if the pass is clear." "We have enough for another week," Clara said. She bit the thread. A small, decisive snap. "We can wait out the storm. There is no need to risk the ice." Elias paused. In his old life, as a hired hand, he would have ridden out simply because the order was given, regardless of the danger. He looked at Clara. She was not commanding him. She was weighing the risk to a person she valued. "You are right," Elias said. "We wait." He watched her hands moving over the fabric. "You should not have to be doing this. Clara, living in a shack, wearing rough wool. With the money from the sale, you could have gone to San Francisco. You could have bought a townhouse and worn silk again." Clara set the needle down. She looked at the rough-hewn walls, the simple bed in the corner, the man with the scarred face who looked at her as if she were the sun rising. "I wore silk for 3 years, Elias," she said quietly, "and I was cold every single day. Here, the wind might freeze my face, but I have never been warmer." She stood up and walked to him, placing her hands on his shoulders. The physical connection between them had grown into a language of its own. In the beginning, in the rush of the escape, it had been desperate. Now, it was a deep, steady current. "Do not mistake comfort for happiness," she said. "I chose this. I chose the work, and I chose you." Elias stood and pulled her into his arms. He was careful with her, always careful, as if he still feared that his touch might bruise. He carried the guilt of his past violence like a heavy stone, afraid that the darkness that had served the Vances might still live in his blood. "I am not a good man, Clara," he whispered into her hair. "I have broken things I cannot fix." "You are not fixed," Clara answered, pulling back to look him in the eye. "And neither am I. We are not furniture to be repaired. We are living things. We grow." "You built this house, Elias." "You kept me alive. That is the man you are now." That night, the intimacy they shared was not a frantic grasping for reassurance. It was slow and deliberate. It was the reclaiming of joy. When Clara lay beside him, skin against skin under the heavy buffalo robes, she felt a profound sense of ownership over her own body. It was no longer a vessel for an heir or a bargaining chip for land. It was hers, to give and to share. And Elias, who had only known transactions or violence, learned that tenderness required more strength than rage ever did. Spring came to Echo Basin not as a gentle awakening, but as a violent upheaval. The creek swelled into torrents, tearing out the beaver dams. The mud was waist-deep, but with the thaw came the green, a shocking, vibrant emerald that carpeted the meadows. It also came with the reminder that the world had not forgotten them. Clara rode down to the settlement at Granite Hollow to collect the mail. It was a small, grimy outpost, mostly a supply stop for miners and trappers. As she walked into the general store, the conversation at the counter died abruptly. Two women in calico bonnets turned away, whispering loudly enough to be heard. "That is her," one hissed. "The Vance widow, living in sin up in the basin with that hired killer." "I heard she testified against her own brother-in-law just to get at the money," the other muttered. "Shameful. A woman alone in the wild. It is unnatural." Clara stood at the counter. She felt the old sting, the heat rising in her neck. The ghost of the girl who wanted to be respectable trembled, but the woman who had crossed the mountains laid her gloved hand on the wood. "Good morning, Mr. Stokes," Clara said to the shopkeeper, her voice clear and level. "I am here for the mail for Echo Creek." The shopkeeper, a man who knew which side his bread was buttered on, hesitated. He looked at the whispering women, then at Clara's steady gaze. He saw the revolver belted at her waist, not for show, but for use. "Yes, ma'am," Stokes mumbled. He reached under the counter. "There is a packet from Laramie." Clara took the heavy envelope. She did not hurry. She checked the seal. She turned to the women who were pretending to inspect a bolt of gingham. "The snow is melting early this year," Clara said to them. "The road to the pass is muddy. If you are traveling, I would advise you to check your carriage wheels. It would be a pity to be stranded in the unnatural wild." She did not wait for a response. She walked out, the boards creaking under her boots. She realized, with a sudden lightness of heart, that their judgment had no teeth. They were judging a ghost. The Clara they gossiped about, the victim, the scandal, did not exist anymore. Back at the cabin, she opened the packet at the kitchen table. Elias stood by the stove, brewing coffee. "It is from Judge Halloway," Clara said, scanning the legal script. "Is it bad news?" Elias asked. "No," Clara said, a smile breaking across her face. "Silas has been sentenced to 20 years in the Territorial Penitentiary. The appeal was denied, and the court has affirmed the transfer of the Circle 5 deed. The money from the sale is irrevocably mine. The Vance family has no claim on me, on the land, or on the funds." Elias let out a breath he seemed to have been holding for 6 months. "It is done, then." "It is done," Clara said. "I am not a ward of the state. I am not a widow in need of protection. I am a free woman with a bank draft and a homestead. But the Vances were not the only threat in the West. The land attracted men who believed that might made right, and a woman holding a prime water claim was a temptation." 2 weeks later, a rider appeared at the edge of their clearing. He was a slick man in a bowler hat, flanked by 2 rough-looking drovers. His name was Sharp, a land agent for a creeping railroad survey that was speculating in the valley. Clara was in the garden, turning the soil for potatoes. Elias was up on the ridge, falling timber. She was alone. Sharp rode up to the fence, looking down at her with a smirk that was all too familiar. "Mrs. Vance," Sharp said, tipping his hat. "Or is it Mrs. Thorne? It is hard to keep track of the arrangements up here." "The name is Vance," Clara said, leaning on her hoe. "And this is private land. You are trespassing. We are just surveying." "Little lady," Sharp said, "this basin has good water. The company is interested in securing rights for a future depot. We are prepared to offer you a fair price, 50 cents an acre." "The land is not for sale," Clara said. "Everything is for sale," Sharp said, his voice hardening, "especially when it is held by a woman playing pioneer. You don't want trouble, ma'am. Accidents happen so far from town. Barns catch fire. Stock wanders off." It was the same language Silas had used, the language of coercion. Clara did not flinch. She did not look for Elias. She walked to the porch, picked up her Winchester, and levered around into the chamber. The metallic clack-clack was loud in the quiet afternoon. "Mr. Sharp," Clara said, "I have buried a husband. I have fought a blizzard, and I have taken down a man who owned half the county. Do you really think I am afraid of a railroad clerk in a bowler hat?" She raised the rifle. aiming it squarely at the chest of the lead horse. "Turn around," she said. "If you cross that creek line again, I will not fire a warning shot." Sharp looked at her face. He saw the absolute absence of bluff. He looked at his hired men, who shifted uneasily in their saddles. "You are making a mistake," Sharp sneered, but he turned his horse. "The only mistake," Clara called after him, "was thinking I was alone." As they rode away, Elias emerged from the trees on the ridge. He had been watching, his own rifle ready, but he hadn't moved. He had stayed back, letting her stand her ground. When he walked down to the garden, he looked at her with a pride that made her throat tight. "You didn't need me," he said. "No," Clara said, lowering the rifle. "I didn't, but I am glad you were there." "I will always be there," Elias said. "Backing you, not leading you." That summer, they found they were not as alone as they thought. The West was vast, but it was full of people who had fallen through the cracks of society. Mateo and his family brought their sheep through the basin in July. They stayed for a week, sharing meals and music. A young boy, no older than 16, stumbled onto their land in August. He was a runaway from a brutal apprenticeship in the mines. He was starving and terrified. Elias did not chase him off. He fed him stew and gave him a blanket in the barn. Over the next few weeks, Clara watched as Elias worked with the boy. He taught him how to chop wood without blistering his hands. He taught him how to gentle a horse. Clara saw Elias healing himself through the boy. He was breaking the cycle of violence he had been raised in. He spoke to the boy with patience. He showed him that strength did not mean cruelty. "You are good at this," Clara told him one evening as they watched the boy practicing with a lasso. "He reminds me of me," Elias said, "before the world got its claws in." "You are saving him," Clara said. "Maybe," Elias said, "or maybe I am just trying to balance the ledger." The seasons turned. The aspen trees on the slopes turned to rivers of gold, shimmering against the dark pine. The air grew crisp, smelling of wood smoke and coming snow. One morning, Clara rose before dawn. She wrapped a shawl around her shoulders and walked out onto the porch. The valley was filled with mist, the peaks rising above it like islands in a silver sea. It was a landscape of ruthless beauty. It could kill you without malice, but it could also give you a morning so radiant it broke your heart. She thought of Samuel. She thought of the girl she had been, the girl who waited for permission to speak. That girl was gone, buried under the snow of the pass. In her place was a woman who knew the weight of a rifle and the warmth of a chosen love. She carried scars. She still had nightmares about the church and the gun at her head, but she was standing upright. The door creaked open behind her. Elias stepped out, pulling his suspenders up over his flannel shirt. He stood beside her, his presence solid and grounding. "Winter is coming," he said, looking at the sky. "Let it come," Clara said. "We are ready." She leaned her head against his shoulder. He wrapped his arm around her waist, his hand resting on the hip where she carried her knife. "Do you ever miss it?" Elias asked. "The town, the ease of it?" "There was no ease, Elias," Clara said. "Only silence. Here, the wind is loud, but the silence inside, that is gone." "I have found my voice, and I have found my home," Elias said. He turned her face to his and kissed her. It was a kiss that tasted of coffee in the cold morning air, a kiss that held the memory of every mile they had traveled. It was not a fairy tale ending. The work would be hard. The world would be harsh. But they had built a fortress of dignity in the high country. They stood together on the porch, watching the sun crest the mountains, flooding the basin with light. They were two survivors who had walked through the fire and found that, against all odds, they had not burned up. They had been forged. "Come," Clara said, taking his hand. "There is wood to chop." "Yes, ma'am." Elias smiled, a true, crooked smile that reached his eyes. They walked off the porch and into the day, side by side, leaving long shadows on the ground that looked, finally, like they belonged there. Thank you for listening to this story of Clara and Elias. It has been a journey through the snow and the dust, exploring how love can be an act of rebellion and survival. I hope their story resonated with you. I would love to know where you are listening from today. Please leave a comment below sharing your location. If you enjoyed this tale of the American West, I encourage you to subscribe to the channel From Wild West so you never miss a new story. Please share your thoughts on the ending. Did Clara and Elias find the justice they deserved? I look forward to reading your comments. Thank you for your time.